Hello and welcome to Spinster's Library. I'm Claudia, and as you may have guessed from the title of this video, I hate Wuthering Heights. So, I'm doing the obvious thing and I'm going to reread it. Before I go any further in this video, let me warn you, this will be full of spoilers for Wuthering Heights. Full of them. If you've not read the book and you don't want to be spoiled about it, I recommend you skip this video. Before I actually start reading this, let me give you my background, my experience with Wuthering Heights. I read Wuthering Heights in my early to mid-20s, 4 or 5 years ago. And I don't remember much about the book at all. I remember seriously disliking it. I remember that this is a weird story within a story within a story type narrative in which completely irrelevant characters recount events that don't affect them and that have nothing to do with them and that are just there to confuse me. I remember that there's two people named Catherine, both of them assholes, one of them possibly the mother of the other Catherine. I remember that there is one sensible person in this entire story, and he gets the short end of the deal. And is there some sort of grave digging going on? I don't remember if someone digs up a body or if someone just digs a grave for someone else, but I distinctly remember some sort of shovel action going on here. Since this is literally all I remember of Wuthering Heights, I am now going to read the book again, and I'm going to check back in after every single chapter to give you my immediate reaction to what I have just read. And I apologise in advance if you love Wuthering Heights and I end up hating the book again. I am sorry, but I will not be holding back with my opinion. Let's get started. The narrator is a guy called Lockwood, who I already remember is completely insignificant in the wider scope of the story, and he's just gone to see his arsehole landlord and his arsehole landlord's dogs. Quite a dreary start so far. I'm already confused. So we have met Mrs. Heathcliff, who is Mr. Heathcliff's daughter-in-law, but it sounds like Mr. Heathcliff's son is dead. And then there's also some random other guy lurking around. Also, our narrator, Mr. Lockwood, is the worst neighbour because he just goes round to other people's homes unannounced and uninvited, which I do not approve of. Lockwood has invited himself over for the night, and there he has a nightmare of the ghost of Catherine crawling in through the window. So now I'm intrigued, not because of the ghost of Catherine, but because of the scene before that where he found her diary and he reads bits of her diary. And I really hope we get to see more from her diary and we get more of her first-hand narration, because she seems like a much more interesting character than Mr. Lockwood. What even is the point of him in this story? So now we've just heard the story told from the perspective of Mrs. Dean, who is the housekeeper in the house that Mr. Lockwood is renting. This book has way too many characters for me to keep track of, but now we are really getting into the story of who Heathcliff is and how he came to be in this story, starting from basically his adoption into the Earnshaw family. In the flashback narration, Mr. Earnshaw, that's Catherine's father, has now died. Mrs. Dean has just told the story that young Heathcliff had told her about how he and young Catherine went and accidentally ended up at the neighbour's house, the Lintons, where she promptly almost got her foot bitten off by a dog. We're still in Mrs. Dean's narration, and she's telling how after Mr. Earnshaw died, how the children kind of ran wild because the older brother didn't really look after them, and we get the beginning of the kind of tragic character background of both Heathcliff and Catherine. We've also seen the introduction of the Linton children, who seem to be there as a contrast to Catherine and Heathcliff. And actually I am quite enjoying this backstory, I'm quite enjoying this narration, but what I really dislike is the way that the story is told through Mrs. Dean telling it to Mr. Lockwood, because those two characters are just completely unnecessary to the actual story. And I like the first person narration of Mrs. Dean, but I wish that it had just been kept to that rather than throwing this completely unnecessary Mr. Lockwood into the mix. Here's where we get to the bit where everyone turns into an abusive asshole. So Catherine, who's by this point a teenager, lashes out both at the housekeeper and at Linton, who's hopelessly in love with her. And then the older brother, Hindley, he comes home, is drunk, and the housekeeper proceeds to hide the child in a cupboard for fear of Hindley hitting him. What a happy family. Catherine has decided to marry Linton despite being in love with Heathcliff, which sounds like a fantastic idea. What could possibly go wrong? And Heathcliff, in the meantime, has disappeared in a sulk. Heathcliff has returned years later after having gained some money and, by the looks of it, some manners, although I don't really trust him. I don't think anyone else does. And Catherine is now Mrs. Linton. Also, Isabella Linton is all over Heathcliff and Catherine is being a bitch about it. So Heathcliff is now all out in the open about his plan to marry Isabella because she's going to inherit the Linton estate if Catherine doesn't have any sons, I think. Oh yeah, and there's also this ridiculous fight between Linton and Heathcliff. Toxic masculinity all over the place. Fun times. Catherine is still recovering from her tantrum. In the meantime, Heathcliff has run off with Isabella and things are getting real dramatic. Isabella has written to Nelly and regrets ever getting married to Heathcliff. She's now miserable at Wuthering Heights. Can't say I'm surprised. So we're now at the end of volume 1 and it seems like a bit of a strange place to end the story, or, you know, to split the story in two, because Heathcliff, who is, surprise, surprise, a horribly abusive husband from day one to Isabella, is just come back to Wuthering Heights, and her and Catherine in the meantime is heavily pregnant and also ill, because that is just what happens to women in this book. The volume ends with this weird bit where our inconsequential narrator Lockwood muses on how sexy the young Catherine is. So that's original Catherine's daughter, who we should remember is just like a teenager at this point. A teenaged widow. Nelly seems to be now facilitating an affair between Catherine and Heathcliff. She arranges this meeting between Heathcliff and Catherine, and then he leaves and she faints for a change. So Catherine died in childbirth and everyone's taken it really well. A lot of deaths in this chapter. So first we have Catherine's brother, not Hareton, is it? Oh, at this point in the book, I still don't know everyone's names. What's this guy's name? Hindley. Hindley died. The narrator, who's still Nelly, also says that Isabella dies later on as well, but not before giving birth to a son, so that is Heathcliff's son, Linton. You can see how these names are really confusing, right? It's not just me, right? Cathy II is now a teenager and, surprise, she's a spoiled brat, like pretty much everyone else in this book. Also, Hareton Earnshaw is kind of the only one who's completely blameless and is really the main victim of this story, because first he gets completely neglected by his father and then he just gets exploited by Heathcliff. Isabella has now died, as was already foreshadowed earlier in the book, and her son Linton has now come to live with the Lintons. So we know from the beginning of the book that he's going to end up married to Catherine II and then is going to die and leave her a widow. But at this point, I have to admit, I am quite intrigued to see how we get to that point, because quite a few people in the story have to still die. Well, mostly Linton, and then also the senior Linton, Edgar, is not around at the beginning of the book, but is still around, so he, I suppose, has to die as well in the course of this. Yeah, I admit I am quite intrigued by the story so far and how we get to the point that we find the characters in at the start of the novel. Poor, fragile Linton is now living in Wuthering Heights, where I suspect he's not going to last very long. Heathcliff has now explained his evil plan, which is to make young Linton and young Cathy fall in love with each other and get married, so that Heathcliff, is then going to inherit the Linton estate when Linton dies, which, I mean, is pretty inevitable at this point. Obviously, Cathy's family aren't too pleased with that, but she manages to kind of evade them and send secret letters back and forth to Linton. Both Edgar Linton and young Linton Heathcliff are now ill and I suspect are going to die within the next few chapters. Baby Linton and baby Catherine are still seeing each other in secret, and even though they're both clearly children and they behave like children, and none of this is a good idea. Well, that was a rather dull telling of how young Cathy and young Linton are still behaving very childishly towards each other. In the meantime, poor Hareton trying to impress her by learning to read. Still more of the same. At this point, I don't really know what young Catherine sees in young Linton and what young Linton sees in young Catherine. Their attachment to each other seems just completely unbelievable. They clearly don't like each other. I can see that maybe Linton is being pressured by Heathcliff to try and woo Catherine. Maybe she's just bored at home, but honestly their budding romance doesn't really seem likely. It doesn't seem likely to me. So I was right, and Heathcliff has been threatening Linton and pressuring him to get married to Catherine, and in order to persuade her, what he does is lock her up in his house and keep her hostage. All the while her father is on his deathbed. I still completely fail to see how anyone finds this book enjoyable. I have to admit it is engaging, but everyone is so bloody miserable that it just makes me miserable to read it. So the young'uns are married now, I'm sure very happily, all the while Heathcliff and his son are still basically holding Catherine hostage. Her father, on his deathbed, is trying to prevent Heathcliff from inheriting the Linton estate, but he fails to do so, partly because the lawyer is in it with Heathcliff, so Edgar dies before he's able to sort out the legal matters, but at least Catherine gets to see him before he dies. I remembered the grave digging incident. So that did happen. That's not something that I made up in my weird imagination. So Heathcliff digs up old Catherine's grave. Just a normal thing to do. Baby Linton is now also dead. We're now back in Mr. Lockwood's narration. He goes to visit Wuthering Heights, and it's pretty obvious that Hareton is into young Catherine. I mean, I suppose she was previously married to her first cousin, so I guess she may as well, you know, have a go at the other first cousin. Time jump, we're now in the future. Heathcliff is dead, and it looks like Catherine is married to Hareton. Happy ending, but there's still 2 chapters to go. This was a rather confusing chapter. I'm not really sure what happened there, but Heathcliff seems to not be quite right. So my guess for the last chapter is that he is going to kill himself, and that's how he's going to die. Because everyone else in this book has died from illness or childbirth. But I think Heathcliff's ending is going to be slightly different. I don't quite understand how exactly he died, how exactly Heathcliff died, because he refuses to eat or sleep, and then he locks himself in his room, and then the next day he's dead. From what I understand. But yeah, so that's the end of the book then. Did I enjoy this more than the first time? Not really, but I appreciate it more. I appreciate the originality of the story. I appreciate the complexity of the characters, and I appreciate the setting and the world that Emily Bronte has woven in this book. I still don't like the narration style. I don't like this kind of crested, nested narration. Although again, I appreciate how she uses unreliable narrators to tell her story. And I really dislike every single one of the characters. And that's the sticking point for me. That's why I just cannot enjoy this book. But I'm glad I reread it. I would say my rating has risen from 2 to 3 stars. And that is because I can see now why people like it. I can see what people find in this book, why people love it. Unfortunately, I'm not one of them. But I hope you enjoyed this journey with me, rediscovering Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. I'm sorry I didn't end up loving it as much as some of you did. But I hope you can forgive me, and I hope maybe it has inspired you to give this another chance as well. When I announced that I was going to do this reread, the responses from you were pretty much split 50-50, people telling me they love it or people telling me they hate it. And if you are one of the people who hate it, then I can encourage you to give this another try, because there is more to the story than I first assumed. Thank you for watching. Bye.